A little girl calls 911 and says, "My dad locked me in the room." The digital clock on Lily Harper's nightstand glowed to 17 a.m. The soft, pink light illuminated a room filled with the typical trappings of an 8-year-old girl, stuffed animals piled haphazardly on a twin bed, a colorful drawing of a rainbow taped to the wall, a small desk cluttered with crayons and half-finished coloring books. But the atmosphere in the room was anything but typical. It was thick with a palpable fear that clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. Lily huddled under her covers, her small body trembling. Her wide, brown eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now clouded with terror. In her hand, she clutched a small, pink cell phone, her lifeline to the outside world. She pressed the 3 familiar numbers 911 and held her breath, praying someone would answer. 911, "What's your emergency?" a calm, female voice responded. Lily's voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound barely audible above the frantic beating of her heart. "Daddy, he locked me in my room." The dispatcher, a seasoned professional named Martha, immediately recognized the fear in the child's voice. She spoke softly, reassuringly. "Okay, sweetie, what's your name?" "Lily. Lily Harper." "And where are you, Lily?" Lily glanced nervously at the door, her heart pounding in her ears. "Brooksville, 42 Oak Street." She rattled off the address she'd memorized countless times, a mantra of safety that now felt utterly useless. "Okay, Lily, stay on the line with me." "Is your daddy there?" Martha asked, her fingers flying across the keyboard, dispatching officers to the address. "Yes," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. He's outside the door. He's angry." Martha could hear the muffled sounds of movement on the other end of the line, the creak of floorboards, a heavy thud. She knew this situation was escalating rapidly. "Lily, can you tell me what happened?" Lily hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she had to be careful. Her father had rules, strict, and yielding rules that she dared not break. But the fear, the raw, animal terror that gripped her, was stronger than any rule. He said I was bad," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "He said I was a liar." The words tumbled out, fragmented and choked with sobs. I just wanted mommy." Suddenly, the sounds outside the door became louder, more distinct. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the hallway. Lily gasped, her eyes widening in panic. "He's coming," she cried, her voice rising in pitch. Martha tried to calm her. "Lily, stay quiet. The police are on their way. Just stay on the line with me, okay?" But it was too late. The doorknob rattled, the lock clicked open, and the door swung inward, revealing the imposing figure of Richard Harper. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his shadow stretching across the room like a predator's. He was a man built of sharp angles and hard edges, his face a mask of cold, controlled anger. Lily instinctively recoiled, shrinking back against the headboard. The phone slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Richard's eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto his daughter's. He didn't need to raise his voice. The silent threat, then spoken warning, was clear. He moved with an unnerving calm, his movements deliberate and precise. He picked up the phone, his gaze never leaving Lily. "Everything is fine," he said into the phone, his voice a low, smooth baritone that belied the fury simmering beneath the surface. "My daughter was having a nightmare. She's a little overly imaginative." He paused, a chilling smile playing on his lips. "False alarm. Sorry to bother you." He ended the call, the click of the disconnect echoing in the silent room. He placed the phone on the nightstand, his movements slow and deliberate, each action a calculated display of power. Lily watched him, her body frozen in terror. She knew what was coming. The lecture, the punishment, the cold, suffocating fear that would envelop her for days, maybe weeks. Richard knelt down, his face inches from Lily's. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Lily," he said softly, his voice a dangerous whisper, "you know the rules. We don't involve outsiders in our family matters. Do you understand?" Lily could only nod, her throat constricted with fear. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own room, in her own home. Richard stood up, his towering figure casting a long, dark shadow over her. "Good," he said. "Now, go to sleep. And don't let this happen again." He turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The lock engaged, sealing Lily back into her prison of fear. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked to 21 a.m. Outside, in the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew closer, a sound of hope that had arrived too late. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet stillness of Brooksville's residential streets. Two patrol cars, their lights flashing, pulled up in front of 42 Oak Street, a seemingly ordinary two-story house with neatly trimmed hedges and a porch swing gently swaying in the night breeze. The scene looked peaceful, idyllic, a stark contrast to the frantic 911 call that had brought them there. Detective Sarah Coleman stepped out of the lead car, her eyes scanning the house. She was a woman in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor honed by years on the force. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her expression was alert, focused. She'd seen enough in her career to know that appearances could be deceiving, that the most ordinary-looking houses could hide the darkest secrets. Her partner, Officer Tom Miller, a younger, more eager officer, joined her. Dispatch said it was a child, right? Possible domestic. Sarah nodded. 8-year-old girl. Said her father locked her in her room. The call was cut short. The clipped, professional tone couldn't entirely mask the underlying concern in her voice. Child calls were always the worst. They approached the front door, Sarah taking the lead. She rang the doorbell, the chime echoing through the silent house. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing Richard Harper. He fit the description Lily had given: tall, imposing, the presence that filled the doorway. But his demeanor was the opposite of what Sarah had expected. He wasn't angry or agitated. Instead, he wore a mask of concerned confusion, his eyebrows furrowed, a hint of worry in his eyes. "Officers," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Is everything all right?" Sarah stepped forward, her badge displayed. "We received a 911 call from this address. A child, a girl named Lily, reported being locked in her room." Richard's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a look of paternal concern. "Oh, dear. That must have been my daughter. She's been having some rather vivid nightmares lately. She gets a bit confused." He gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. "Kids, you know." The explanation was smooth, almost too smooth. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of dealing with liars and manipulators, were on high alert. "We'd still like to speak with her, sir, just to be sure." Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible pause that didn't escape Sarah's notice. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "She's upstairs. I'll take you to her." He led them through the house, which was impeccably clean and tidy, almost sterile. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no raised voices. It was the picture of suburban normalcy, a carefully constructed facade that made Sarah's unease grow stronger. They reached the second floor, and Richard led them to a closed door at the end of the hallway. He knocked softly. "Lily, honey, there are some police officers here to see you. They just want to make sure you're okay." There was no answer. Richard opened the door, revealing Lily's room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her small frame rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on her father. She looked like a porcelain doll, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Sarah knelt down in front of her, her voice softening. "Hi, Lily. My name is Detective Coleman. We got a call from you earlier. Are you all right?" Lily didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her gaze remained locked on her father, a silent, desperate plea hidden within their depths. Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on Lily's shoulder. "She's just a little shaken up," he said smoothly. "Nightmares, you see. She gets confused sometimes." Sarah ignored him, her focus entirely on Lily. "Lily," she repeated gently, "can you tell me what happened?" Lily's lips trembled, but no sound came out. She glanced at her father, a flicker of fear in her eyes, then quickly looked away. The silent message was clear. She was terrified. Sarah stood up, her gaze hardening as she turned to Richard. "Mr. Harper, I'd like to speak with Lily alone, please." Richard's smile faltered slightly, a hint of irritation flickering in his eyes. "I'm not sure that's necessary, Detective. She's clearly just upset from the nightmare." "It's standard procedure, sir," Sarah said firmly. "We need to ensure her safety." He hesitated again, then gave a tight nod. Very well. I'll be downstairs. He gave Lily one last, lingering look before leaving the room, closing the door behind him. Sarah turned back to Lily, her expression softening again. Lily, she said quietly, it's okay. You can talk to me. Your dad's not here. No one's going to hurt you. Lily remained silent, her body tense, her eyes darting towards the door as if expecting her father to reappear at any moment. The fear was palpable, a suffocating presence in the small room. Sarah knew she had a limited window of opportunity. She had to break through Lily's terror, to convince her that she could trust her. But how? She had seen this before, the paralyzing fear that domestic abuse instilled in its victims. It was a wall, a barrier built by years of control and intimidation. And Sarah knew that breaking down that wall would be the hardest, and most important, task of her career. Downstairs, Emily Harper moved through the motions of her evening routine, the silence of the house pressing down on her like a physical weight. She was a woman in her early 30s, with a delicate beauty that was slowly fading under the strain of her life. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a permanent shadow of weariness. She washed the dinner dishes, her hands moving mechanically, her mind miles away. She thought of Lily upstairs in her room, probably still shaken from her nightmare. The word felt bitter on her tongue. She knew the truth, the unspoken reality that hung between her and Richard like a suffocating shroud. She'd learned to live with it, to navigate the treacherous waters of his moods, to anticipate his anger, to become a master of avoidance. Survival, she had learned, was about making yourself small, invisible, about anticipating his every whim. As she dried a plate, her hand brushed against a small, wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. It was a box of old photographs, mementos from a life she barely remembered, a life before Richard. Curiosity, a rare and dangerous emotion in her current existence, tugged at her. She pulled the box down, her heart beating a little faster. She sat at the kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light illuminating the faded photographs. There were pictures of her younger self, laughing, carefree, surrounded by friends and family. A pang of longing, sharp and unexpected, pierced her heart. She had been a different person then, full of dreams and hopes that had long since withered under Richard's controlling gaze. She flipped through the photos, her fingers tracing the faces of people she hadn't seen in years. Then, she stopped. A photograph, tucked away at the back of the box, caught her eye. It was a picture of Richard, younger but still recognizable, his arm around a woman she'd never seen before. The woman was beautiful, with long, dark hair and a radiant smile. There was a lightness in her eyes, a joy that mirrored the woman Emily used to be. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was a single name, Margaret, and a date, 1998. Richard had never mentioned a Margaret. He'd always told her that she was his first and only love, that he'd never been married before. A wave of nausea washed over Emily. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. She searched the box frantically, looking for more pictures of Margaret, more clues. But there was nothing. It was as if this one photograph was the only trace of her existence. Emily's mind raced. Who was Margaret? What had happened to her? The questions swirled in her head, feeding the growing unease that was taking root in her soul. She remembered snippets of conversations, odd remarks Richard had made over the years, things she'd dismissed at the time but now seemed loaded with sinister meaning. He'd talked about his past, about mistakes he'd made, about a relationship that had ended badly. He'd always been vague, evasive, and she'd learned not to press him. But now, staring at the photograph of this beautiful, smiling woman, Emily knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She felt a primal fear, a deep-seated instinct that told her she and Lily were in danger. The carefully constructed walls of denial she'd built around herself began to crumble. She had to know the truth. And she had to protect her daughter. The next morning, Sarah Coleman sat at her desk in the Brooksville Police Department, the image of Lily's terrified face etched in her mind. The initial report was filed as a domestic disturbance and founded, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong at the Harper residence. Richard Harper's smooth demeanor, Lily's silence, the sterile perfection of the house, it all added up to a picture that didn't quite fit. She pulled up Richard Harper's file on her computer. There was nothing significant, a few minor traffic violations, no history of violence or domestic complaints. It was almost a clean to perfect. Experienced investigators, Sarah knew that perfect often meant careful. He's good, she muttered to herself, leaning back in her chair. He knows how to cover his tracks. She decided to dig deeper. She started with the Brooksville County Records Office, requesting any and all records pertaining to Richard Harper, marriage licenses, property records, court documents, anything that might shed light on his past. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Brenda, looked skeptical. Richard Harper, he's a pillar of the community. You sure you got the right guy? Sarah smiled thinly. Just doing my due diligence, Brenda. Hours later, Sarah was staring at a stack of documents, her frustration growing. There was nothing. No prior marriages, no restraining orders, no lawsuits, no police reports. It was as if Richard Harper had sprung into existence fully formed, a man without a past. Then, a small detail caught her eye. In the property records, there was a note about a previous address, a small town about an hour outside of Brooksville. The property had been sold several years ago. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was something. She contacted the police department in the neighboring town, requesting any information they had on Richard Harper. The response came a few hours later. A single, terse email, no records found. However, there was an unsolved missing person case around the time Harper lived here. A woman named Margaret Harper. Her husband, Richard Harper, was a person of interest, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. Sarah's blood ran cold. Margaret. The name from the photograph. It was no longer a hunch, it was a pattern. A chilling, terrifying pattern. She had to find out more about Margaret Harper, about her disappearance, and about the man who seemed to have erased her from existence. She decided to start by finding any living relatives. Another dead end. Margaret's parents were deceased. No siblings. Sarah felt that old familiar frustration. But she wasn't going to give up. She felt she owed it to both Margaret and Lily. Lily sat at her desk in Mrs. Davis's third-grade class, trying to focus on the math lesson, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The events of the previous night played over and over in her head. Her father's angry face, the police officers, her own terrified silence. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Daniel, a boy with kind eyes and a messy mop of brown hair, sitting behind her. He slipped her a folded piece of paper, his expression serious. Lily unfolded the note cautiously. It read, "I know what happened. My mom can help. Don't talk to anyone else." Lily's heart skipped a beat. Daniel was the only person at school she felt even remotely comfortable with. He was quiet and unassuming, but she'd sensed a quiet strength in him, a sense of empathy that set him apart from the other kids. She glanced around the classroom, making sure Mrs. Davis wasn't looking, then scribbled a response on the back of the note. How? Daniel took the note back, read her question, and wrote, "My mom's a lawyer. She knows about these things. We can talk at recess." Recess was a chaotic blur of noise and activity, but Lily managed to find Daniel near the swings. He looked around nervously, making sure no one was listening. "My mom said what your dad is doing is called abuse," he whispered. "It's against the law. She said you and your mom need to get away from him." Lily's eyes welled up with tears. She'd never heard anyone say the word abuse before. It was a forbidden word, a secret she'd been forced to keep hidden. "But how?" she whispered back. "He watches us all the time. We can't even talk on the phone." Daniel's face was grim. "My mom said it's going to be hard, but it's not impossible. She said there are places you can go, safe places where he can't find you. She said she can help you get a restraining order. That means he can't come near you." The words were like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped her life. For the first time in a long time, Lily felt a tiny spark of courage ignite within her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Emily spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind consumed by the photograph of Margaret and the terrifying implications it held. She started to see Richard in a new light, noticing the subtle ways he controlled her, the constant surveillance, the veiled threats disguised as concern. She knew she had to escape, not just for her own sake, but for Lily's. The thought of her daughter growing up in the shadow of Richard's abuse filled her with a desperate, primal fear. One afternoon, while Richard was at work, Emily received a call from Sarah Coleman. Sarah had been careful, using a burner phone and speaking in coded language, but the message was clear. She knew about Margaret, and she believed Emily and Lily were in danger. They arranged to meet at a small, out-of-the-way diner, a place where Richard would never think to look. Emily was terrified, but she knew she had no choice. Sitting across from Sarah in a worn booth, Emily poured out her story, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperation. She told Sarah about the photograph, about Richard's controlling behavior, about her growing fear for Lily's safety. Sarah listened patiently, her expression grim. "Emily," she said finally, "you and Lily are in serious danger. Richard is a classic abuser. He's isolated you, controlled you, and he's likely done the same thing before." She explained the situation with Margaret, the missing person case, the lack of evidence. Emily felt a wave of cold terror wash over her. She was living a nightmare, a horrifying echo of a past she hadn't even known existed. "We need to get you out," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to get you and Lily to a safe place, somewhere he can't find you." They discussed options: a women's shelter, a secret location out of state, a legal restraining order. Emily felt overwhelmed, but Sarah's calm, determined presence gave her strength. "I have a friend," Sarah continued, "a lawyer. She specializes in domestic abuse cases. She can help us with the legal side of things, get a restraining order, and start building a case against Richard." She mentioned that it was Daniel's mother. Emily's eyes widened. The puzzle pieces that had been circling finally fell into place. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do anything," she whispered. "I have to protect Lily." They hatched a plan, a risky and complicated escape that would require perfect timing and unwavering courage. They knew that one wrong move, one slip-up, could have devastating consequences. Richard's suspicions had been growing steadily over the past few days. He'd noticed the subtle changes in Emily's behavior, the furtive glances, the way she flinched when he touched her. He was a man who thrived on control, and he sensed that control slipping away. He'd started monitoring her phone calls, checking her emails, even following her when she went out. He found the burner phone. He didn't know who she was talking to, but he knew it was someone she didn't want him to know about. The night after Emily's meeting with Sarah, Richard confronted her. He didn't yell or threaten. He used a different tactic, a chillingly calm, controlled anger that was far more terrifying. "Emily," he said, his voice low and smooth, "I know you've been talking to someone. I know you're planning something." Emily tried to deny it, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "I always find out the truth. Always." He didn't physically harm her, but the threat was implicit in his words, in his posture, in the cold, hard glint in his eyes. He tightened his grip, increasing his surveillance, making it almost impossible for Emily to communicate with Sarah. He took away her car keys, her phone, her access to the outside world. He became her shadow, constantly watching, constantly reminding her of his power. Escape seemed impossible. Emily felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a cage of fear and control. The plan was set. Emily and Lily were to leave the next morning, while Richard was at work. Sarah had arranged for a safe house, a place where they could hide until the legal proceedings were underway. Emily had packed a small bag, containing only the essentials: clothes, toiletries, important documents. She'd hidden the bag in the attic, praying Richard wouldn't find it. That morning, as Richard was getting ready for work, Emily felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was it. There was no turning back. She woke Lily early, her voice trembling. "Honey," she whispered, "we're going on a trip. A surprise trip." Lily, sensing the urgency in her mother's voice, didn't ask questions. She got dressed quickly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. As Richard was leaving, he kissed Emily on the cheek, his touch sending a shiver of revulsion down her spine. "I'll be late tonight," he said. "Don't wait up." Emily forced a smile. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. As soon as Richard's car pulled out of the driveway, Emily grabbed the hidden bag and rushed Lily out the back door. They were supposed to meet Sarah at a nearby park, a neutral location where they could make the transfer. But as they reached the end of the driveway, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was Richard. He'd been waiting for them. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the look on Richard's face. It was the first time she'd seen him showing his true colors. Lily screamed and ran to her mother, clinging to her leg. Richard advanced towards them, his eyes blazing with fury. "You thought you could get away from me," he snarled. "You thought you could defy me." Emily knew this was it, the moment she'd been dreading. She stood her ground, her body trembling, but her resolve firm. "We're leaving, Richard," she said, her voice shaking. "We're not going to live in fear anymore." Richard lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a grip that was like a vice. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. Emily struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. Lily was screaming, crying, pulling at her father's leg, trying to distract him. Emily, desperate, and knowing this was her only chance, pulled out the gun Sarah had given her from the bag. "Let us go, Richard." Richard looked at the gun. He didn't stop. He didn't believe Emily would do it. Emily fired the gun, a single shot that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Richard staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He clutched at his chest, his face contorted in pain, and collapsed to the ground. The sound of the gunshot brought neighbors rushing out of their houses, their faces etched with shock and confusion. Emily stood frozen, the gun still clutched in her trembling hand, staring at Richard's body lying motionless on the ground. Lily, sobbing uncontrollably, clung to her mother's leg. The world seemed to spin around Emily, a chaotic blur of noise and movement. Sarah Coleman arrived within minutes, her face pale but determined. She'd heard the shot from a distance and her heart had leaped into her throat. She quickly assessed the situation, taking control with practiced efficiency. "Emily, it's okay," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You did what you had to do." She took the gun from Emily's hand, her touch gentle. Officer Miller, Sarah's partner, arrived on the scene, followed by paramedics and additional police units. The neighborhood was swarming with activity, the quiet morning shattered by the violence. The paramedics worked frantically on Richard, their faces grim. He was still alive, but barely. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital, sirens wailing. Sarah took Emily and Lily aside, shielding them from the chaos. "You're safe now," she said, her voice soothing. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe." She drove them to a nearby police station, a secure location where they could be interviewed and protected. Emily was in shock, her mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop seeing Richard's face as he fell to the ground. Lily was traumatized, clinging to her mother, her small body racked with sobs. Sarah tried to comfort her, offering her a teddy bear and a glass of water, but the little girl was inconsolable. Richard was taken into custody at the hospital, under police guard. He was in critical condition, but he was expected to survive. He was charged with multiple crimes, domestic abuse, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. The investigation into Margaret Harper's disappearance was reopened, with Richard as the prime suspect. The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, interviews, and therapy sessions. Sarah Coleman worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a strong case against Richard. Daniel's mother, Susan, a lawyer, provided invaluable legal assistance to Emily and Lily. She helped them obtain a restraining order against Richard, ensuring that he couldn't contact them or come near them. She also began preparing for the upcoming trial, gathering evidence and lining up witnesses. The biggest challenge was proving the history of abuse. Richard had been meticulous in covering his tracks, leaving no physical evidence, no police reports, no witnesses. Emily's testimony was crucial, but it was her word against his. Sarah focused on establishing a pattern of controlling behavior, interviewing neighbors, friends, and former colleagues of Richard. She slowly pieced together a picture of a man who was a master manipulator, a man who controlled and isolated his victims, leaving them with no one to turn to. The discovery of Margaret Harper's photograph was a key piece of evidence. Sarah tracked down Margaret's old address records, hoping to find any clue that might shed light on her disappearance. It was a long shot, but she was determined to leave no stone unturned. Finally, a break came. Sarah discovered a small, independent storage unit rented under a false name, but with a billing address linked to Richard. She obtained a warrant and searched the unit. Inside, she found boxes of Margaret's belongings, clothes, journals, letters, and, most importantly, a diary. Margaret's diary was a chilling account of her life with Richard, detailing his escalating abuse, his controlling behavior, his threats, and her growing fear. It was a powerful piece of evidence, a voice from the past that confirmed Emily's story and exposed Richard's true nature. Sarah's investigation also led her to Sheriff Holloway, the corrupt local law enforcement officer who had been protecting Richard for years. Holloway was a man with a reputation for looking the other way, for protecting the wealthy and powerful in Brooksville. Sarah suspected that Holloway had been involved in covering up Richard's past, possibly even in Margaret's disappearance. She started digging into his financial records, looking for any evidence of payments or favors from Richard. She found it. A series of large, unexplained deposits into Holloway's offshore bank account, coinciding with the time of Margaret's disappearance. It was circumstantial, but it was enough to raise serious suspicions. Sarah confronted Holloway, laying out the evidence she had gathered. Holloway, initially defiant, started to crumble under the pressure. He knew he was cornered. He finally confessed. He admitted to taking bribes from Richard, to suppressing police reports, to helping him cover up his abuse of Emily and his involvement in Margaret's disappearance. He claimed he didn't know exactly what had happened to Margaret, but he knew Richard was responsible. He'd been too afraid to speak out, fearing Richard's power and influence. Holloway's confession was a major victory. It not only provided further evidence against Richard but also exposed the corruption within the Brooksville law enforcement system. Holloway was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy. Richard's trial was a media circus. The story of the wealthy, respected businessman who had secretly abused his wives and possibly murdered his first wife captivated the nation. Emily, despite her fear and anxiety, testified against Richard. She recounted the years of abuse, the control, the threats, the fear that had ruled her life. Her testimony was powerful and emotional, bringing tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom. Lily, too, testified, her small voice trembling but clear. She described her father's anger, his punishments, the night she'd called 911. Her testimony, though brief, was heartbreaking and damning. Susan, Daniel's mother, presented a compelling case, weaving together Emily's and Lily's testimonies, Margaret's diary, Holloway's confession, and the forensic evidence from the storage unit. Richard, represented by a high-powered defense attorney, maintained his innocence. He claimed that Emily was unstable, that she had shot him in a fit of rage, that he was the victim. His attorney tried to discredit Emily and Lily, painting them as liars and manipulators. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury, after deliberating for several hours, returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emily and Lily, sitting in the courtroom, holding hands, finally felt a sense of relief. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the scars of Richard's abuse ran deep, and the road to healing would be long and difficult. Emily and Lily moved to a new town, far away from Brooksville, hoping to start a new life, free from the shadow of Richard Harper. They found a small, cozy house, enrolled Lily in a new school, and tried to create a sense of normalcy. But the fear lingered. Emily found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at sudden noises, having nightmares about Richard. She knew that even though he was behind bars, he still posed a threat. One evening, a few weeks after the sentencing, Emily received a chilling reminder. She found a small, white envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of her and Lily, taken that very day, as they were leaving the grocery store. There was no note, no message, just the photograph. Emily's blood ran cold. Someone was watching them. Richard's reach extended beyond the prison walls. She immediately contacted Sarah Coleman, who was equally alarmed. Sarah knew that Richard had allies on the outside, people who were loyal to him, people who were willing to do his bidding. Sarah, now more determined than ever to protect Emily and Lily, launched a new investigation, focusing on Richard's contacts outside of prison. She knew that he must have a network of people helping him, people who were willing to carry out his threats. She started by reviewing his prison visitor logs, his phone calls, his mail. She identified a few key individuals, people with criminal records, people with known ties to Richard. She began surveilling these individuals, tracking their movements, monitoring their communications. It was a painstaking process, requiring patience and persistence. She discovered that Richard was communicating with a former business associate, a man named Frank Miller, no relation to Officer Miller, who had a history of violence and intimidation. Frank had been visiting Richard regularly in prison, and Sarah suspected that he was acting as Richard's intermediary, carrying out his orders. Sarah knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let Richard continue to terrorize Emily and Lily from behind bars. Richard's plan was subtle at first. Small acts of vandalism targeted Emily and Lily's new home. Tires slashed, windows broken, threatening messages spray-painted on the garage door. Emily was terrified. She knew this was just the beginning. Richard was playing a psychological game, trying to break her down, to make her feel unsafe, to remind her that he still had power over her. Lily was also deeply affected. She became withdrawn, having nightmares again, refusing to go to school. The trauma of the past was resurfacing, threatening to undo all the progress they had made. Emily felt helpless, trapped in a cycle of fear and anxiety. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering when the next attack would come. Desperate, Emily reached out to Sarah again. She explained the escalating threats, the fear that was consuming her and Lily. Sarah listened patiently, her expression grim. She knew that Richard was a dangerous man, even behind bars. He was a master manipulator, and he wouldn't hesitate to use violence to get what he wanted. Sarah reassured Emily that she would do everything in her power to protect them. She increased police patrols around their house, installed a security system, and provided them with personal safety devices. She also intensified her investigation into Richard's outside contacts, focusing on Frank Miller. She obtained a warrant to tap Miller's phone, hoping to gather evidence that would link him to the harassment. The phone taps revealed a series of coded conversations between Miller and Richard, discussing deliveries, messages, and making sure she understands. It was clear that they were planning something, but Sarah couldn't decipher the specifics. Sarah, through painstaking investigation and wiretaps, finally pieced together Richard's plan. Frank Miller, acting on Richard's orders, was planning to kidnap Lily. The deliveries and messages were code words for the kidnapping operation. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. She assembled a team of officers and prepared to raid Miller's house, where they believed he was holding Lily. The raid was swift and decisive. Miller was caught off guard, arrested without incident. But Lily was not there. Interrogation of Frank didn't get Sarah any new information. Then Sarah found a clue in Frank's house. It's an old photo of Frank, Richard, and a woman. Sarah feels that woman is very familiar. Then she remembered, she is the police dispatcher, Martha. Sarah immediately go to Martha, with all the evidence. Martha finally confessed. She had feeling for Richard a long time ago, and she told Sarah where Lily is. They found Lily, scared but unharmed, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She had been held captive for several hours, but she was physically unharmed. Emily and Lily were united, their relief and joy overwhelming. The nightmare was finally over. Richard, facing additional charges for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, had his sentence extended. He was transferred to a maximum security prison, where his contact with the outside world was severely restricted. Frank Miller and Martha were also convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The network of corruption and intimidation that Richard had built was finally dismantled. Emily and Lily, with the help of therapy and the support of Sarah and Susan, began the long process of healing. They moved to a new state, started new identities, and tried to put the past behind them. But the scars remained. Emily still struggled with anxiety and fear, and Lily continued to have nightmares. The trauma of their experience would likely stay with them for the rest of their lives. The final scene shows Richard in his prison cell, staring at a photograph of Emily and Lily. A faint smile plays on his lips. He may be behind bars, but his mind is still plotting, still scheming. Men like Richard Harper never truly give up. The battle may be over, but the war, in his mind, continues. The future, for Emily and Lily, remains uncertain. While they have found safety for now, the shadow of Richard Harper, even from behind bars, continues to loom. They can only hope that they have built a strong enough foundation to withstand any future attempts he might make to reach them. They live with the knowledge that vigilance is their constant companion, and their resilience their greatest weapon.